still remember the taste of that night, the scent of pine, the taste of fear, and the metallic echo of my own heartbeat. The mating ceremony was meant to end my freedom, to bury the last spark of defiance still burning inside me. So I ran. I ran through the forest like a desperate, terrified prayer torn from its god, trembling, half alive, propelled only by a sheer, violent refusal to submit. And when I collided with him, the world simply ceased to move. His scent was not just power and storm, but lightning contained, ancient and elemental. His sheer presence was a silence that was more terrifying than any command, a profound authority my body understood on a cellular level, long before my rational mind could process the danger. I begged him for shelter, for a temporary reprieve from the hunters closing in, but mercy was too small a thing for a male like him. He didn't ask my name or where I came from. He took the entirety of my destiny. That night, I thought I had succeeded in escaping the claustrophobic cage they built for me, shedding the skin of a submissive omega, but I discovered I had merely walked into a legend, bound to the will of the most potent alpha in existence. And even now, when the citadel is quiet and the moon is high, I can still feel his voice inside me, not as a command to obey, but as a deep, resonant calling, pulling my very soul towards the source of its terrifying, magnificent destiny, a destiny that felt like pure, unadulterated fire. My name is Chloe Sinclair, and I was a 22-year-old Omega, designated to be nothing more than property. Yet, deep within the silence and shadow of the coven walls, a forbidden dream had taken root since my earliest memories, a dream that was treasonous in its very nature. I remember being a small child, peering out of the high, narrow, stone-framed windows of the nursery, seeing the dense forest, the menacing gloam tangle, not as a danger, but as a promise of limitless space, and most importantly, of choice. When I was barely 10 years old, I found a secret creek, hidden behind a thicket of weeping willows, and it became my silent sanctuary. It was the only place where I allowed myself to pretend my designation didn't exist. There, under the filtered sunlight, I imagined myself as an alpha, strong and free, capable of deciding my own destiny, capable of choosing a mate and defining my own love, rather than accepting the coven's decree. This impossible dream, this fierce internal belief that my life belonged to me, was my most guarded secret, the silent rebellion that fueled every single act of emotional resistance. Now, years later, that vibrant dream had been brutally suffocated by the rigid, cold, old-world hierarchy of the Blackwood Coven. Every single aspect of my life was defined by the shadow of ancient, unyielding laws. This was a pack built on stone and fear, where my designation meant compliance, weakness, and servitude, enforced with an emotional brutality that scarred deeper than any whip. Every breath I took within those heavy, dark-timbered walls was a stolen, borrowed one. Every step measured, every thought policed by the pervasive sense of dread. The coven structure itself felt like a cage, low ceilings, narrow, dimly lit corridors that always smelled of damp earth and stale obedience. My entire existence was meticulously mapped out, governed by rules that had long ago choked out any trace of independence or joy. The very air of Blackwood felt thick and stale, laden with the crushing weight of generations of unquestioning obedience. The elders, grim-faced ancient males whose authority was carved deeper than the wrinkles on their hands, decreed the summer solstice to be the day of my mating ceremony, the final, irreversible day I would be legally and spiritually bound to Alpha Wallace Thompson. Wallace, 28 years old, was the precise embodiment of the coven's decay and small-minded cruelty, entitled, arrogant, and casually cruel, treating the world as his personal spoils. He didn't seek a partner or a mate. He demanded property to validate his shaky authority and quell his own insecurities. He viewed me not as a person with a soul or a spirit, but as a prize, the ultimate symbol of his unchallenged control over the lowest designation in the pack. His cold, calculating glances across the dining hall, or during the obligatory pre-ceremony introductions, were proprietary and cold, promising not a gentle, shared life, but endless possession and consumption. The thought of his dry, clammy, proprietary touch, his soft, weak lips, made my skin crawl with an instinctive, violent revulsion. His anticipated possession felt less like a marriage and more like a death sentence to my spirit, a slow, agonizing burial of the true, rebellious self I guarded deep inside. The weeks leading up to the solstice were a deliberate, calculated campaign of psychological attrition. I was forced to sit through countless monotonous sessions, subjected to chilling, repeated reminders of my inevitable place. Elder warriors, their faces impassive and their voices monotonous, ensured I understood the utter futility of resistance. They would corner me in the dimly lit corridors, their gazes heavy with pity and contempt, reminding me in chilling detail that the Omega collar, a heavy, cold weight of dull, oxidized silver, was waiting, and that escape was not only impossible, but an act of suicidal folly. They spoke of the collar as a mercy, a binding that would end my pointless struggle and bring me peace through enforced obedience. My internal refusal, however, began to burn like a low, steady fever in my veins, fueled by the memory of the sunlight on the hidden creek. It was a secret, fierce defiance, a flame deep in my core that refused to be extinguished by their regulations. I had no escape plan. No allies, only that fierce, unyielding internal refusal to surrender my soul to his tyranny and the coven's decaying stagnation. The morning of the ceremony was the absolute worst. The great hall, the elders' chambers, and even the relative sanctuary of my own small, sparse room were intentionally and thoroughly doused with the binding scents, a sickly sweet, cloying, potent herbal blend, prepared meticulously by the healers. Its purpose was sinister, to suppress any last vestige of my defiant spirit, dampening the Omega's natural drive for self-preservation and heightening my natural subservience to male authority. The fragrance was everywhere, seeping into the wooden furniture, clinging to the heavy velvet curtains, and permeating my very clothes, poisoning the air I breathed. Under its influence, my mind felt thick, heavy, and dull, clogged with an enforced, hazy obedience that made decision-making feel like wading through thick, suffocating mud. My emotions were severely muted, and the sharp, bright edges of my rebellion were systematically blunted, making me feel drowsy and compliant. It required every ounce of my will, just to breathe and think clearly, fighting the debilitating lethargy and the dreadful, overwhelming urge to simply submit, to let the current of fate drag me under. I knew with terrifying clarity that once the ritual was complete, once that dull, cold collar was fastened, the enforced obedience would become absolute, locking away the person I had once been forever. The final, irrevocable moment arrived hours later, under the intense, oppressive scrutiny of the entire coven, the moment that shattered my world and changed everything. I was draped in suffocating silk, the heavy, expensive fabric feeling less like a wedding gown and much more like a shroud, trapping the heat and the cloying scent around me. I stood before the assembled elders and the grim-faced pack, the air dense and almost paralyzing with the inescapable scent of forced submission, which made the back of my throat burn, and my vision swim slightly. Wallace stood opposite me, his lips already curled into a sneer of premature victory, his small eyes gleaming with triumphant malice, a look that promised years of resentment and forced compliance. He reached out to me, his hand cold and clammy, his movement heavy with the cold, crushing authority of a lesser male staking a desperate legal claim. In his hand, catching the dull, ceremonial light filtering through the high, stained-glass windows of the chamber, was the heavy silver Omega collar, a brutal, undeniable symbol of my impending servitude. It looked dull, thick, and horrifically permanent. As he lifted it, his movements slow and deliberate, preparing to lock the clasp around the vulnerable curve of my neck and securing my fate forever. The sheer, crushing weight of my impending captivity snapped the last fragile thread of my will. It was not a reasoned thought, but a visceral animal reaction, a primal scream of self-preservation tearing through the dull, thick haze of the binding scent. My heart hammered, an erratic, frantic, desperate drumbeat of pure, blinding rebellion, suddenly overpowering the herbal haze. Instead of bowing my head in the traditional gesture of submission that Wallace expected, I lifted my eyes. I met his entitled gaze with a burst of furious, unadulterated defiance, an explosion of internal rage that gave me a sudden, shocking strength, and I shoved him with all the force of my unleashed desperation. It was a surge of unexpected raw power, shocking the entire assembly into a stunned, horrified silence. Wallace stumbled back, his surprise momentarily fracturing his weak arrogance, his eyes wide and bewildered. That fraction of a second of stunned silence was all I needed. I spun on my heel and ran, tearing through the stunned ceremonial chambers. The heavy silk ripped audibly on the stone doorway as I burst out into the cool, dense, moonlit forest, executing the reckless flight. My lungs burned immediately, fueled not by air, but by pure adrenaline and the sheer mind-numbing terror of what I had just left behind. Every footfall was a desperate, panicked prayer, driven by the knowledge that they would execute me for this betrayal. I tore through the thick undergrowth, dodging the labyrinthine maze of roots and shadows known only to the pack as the gloam tangle. The rough, low-hanging branches whipped violently at my face and arms, leaving hot, stinging trails on my exposed skin, but I didn't dare slow my pace. I was running not to a destination, but fiercely from a death, from a life of emotional erasure. I knew I had mere minutes, perhaps less, before the coven's surprise would wear off, and their organized, disciplined pursuit would begin. The silence lasted too long, then broke with the heavy sound of organized movement. And then I heard them behind me, the enraged shouts of Wallace, his voice raw with frustrated ownership and humiliation, and the heavier, coordinated footfalls of the elder warriors, their training kicking in. They had quickly picked up my scent trail, a potent, volatile mix of my pure terror and the lingering, cloying herbs of the binding scents. They were closing in with brutal, efficient speed, their numbers and discipline a terrifying certainty. In my blind panic, sprinting through the treacherous, uneven maze of tangled roots and shadowed trunks, I failed utterly to see the massive obstacle ahead. I collided with him, a wall of densely packed, rock-hard muscle that felt less like flesh and more like ancient, unyielding stone, a force of nature I could not penetrate. The impact stole the breath from my body, sending me sprawling backward onto the cold, damp earth, gasping for air that would not come. I scrambled desperately, looking up into a face that felt ancient and utterly indifferent, carved from granite, his gaze the color of polished steel under the fractured moonlight. He was immense, radiating a dark, coiled energy that made the forest itself seem to hold its breath. The scent hit me instantly and irrevocably, overriding the terror, overriding everything. A heavy, sharp aroma of true, uncontested dominance, utterly intoxicating and terrifying in its primal authority. It was storm and ozone and deep, ancient forest, a scent so pure alpha that it silenced my frantic heart and commanded the very air around me, forcing a recognition I could not fight. Every instinct in my omega biology screamed submission, shelter, safety. "Stop," he said, his voice strong and deep, resonating with an authority that allowed no challenge, a sound that demanded absolute truth and immediate obedience. Tears, born of terror and exhaustion, sprang to my eyes, but I pushed myself onto my knees, disregarding all dignity, all pretense of composure, offering my most vulnerable self. "Please," I choked out, the word raw with desperation and fear, a desperate plea for protection. "They're hunting me. I was escaping a forced mating ceremony in the Omega Collar. Shield me. I will do anything you ask. Anything. My life, my service, my entire future. Don't let them take me." He didn't move. He simply studied me, my smeared terror, my ripped silk, the defiant spark still visible beneath the desperation. His eyes, the color of cold silver, scanned the small, vulnerable Omega kneeling before him, and then, slowly, a cold, chilling, proprietary possessiveness erupted from him, like ice freezing over a vast, rushing river. A choice being made. "You promise me anything? Your life? Your service? Your loyalty?" he asked, the question a quiet, dangerous lure, testing the extent of my desperation. "Yes, anything," I gasped, the word final. "Absolute." "Then I don't merely shield you," he stated, his voice now laced with absolute, chilling finality. He stepped closer, his powerful scent intensifying, wrapping around me like a territorial marker, a declaration that felt more potent than any physical cage, sealing my fate with him instead. "I claim you. You are mine," just as the final possessive word left his lips, sealing the new, terrifying bond. Wallace Thompson and 2 elder warriors burst through the trees into the small clearing. They skidded to a stop, their expressions a mix of anger, triumphant pursuit, and then immediate, catastrophic confusion. "There she is! You defy the elders, Chloe Sinclair? She is bound to me. She is my property. Seize her!" Wallace spat, his voice shaking with frustrated rage, blind to the presence before him. The formidable stranger finally moved. A single, deliberate gesture. He raised a scarred, powerful left hand, and on his ring finger, catching the sharp gleam of the distant moon, was the Kincaid seal, an ancient, legendary piece of gold and deep black obsidian that instantly symbolized absolute, unchallengeable authority over all packs. The 2 elder warriors, who had been charging forward, instantly ceased, their heads bowed low to the earth, trembling violently not from cold, but from sheer primal terror, induced by the Alpha King's presence. Wallace's sneer of arrogant victory dissolved in a horrifying instant, replaced by a ghastly, white-faced shock of realization. You can't be," he stammered, his eyes wide and vacant, unable to finish the blasphemous sentence. The stranger introduced himself in a voice that now echoed with the immense weight of generations, silencing the very rustle of the leaves around them. "My name is Reese Kincaid. I am the Alpha King, and this is my territory." Wallace crumpled onto his knees. A defeated, small man, his petty cruelty instantly erased by the overwhelming presence of a true legend. Rhys looked down at my former pack with utter contempt, then his terrifying gaze snapped back to me, his eyes burning with possessive fire, marking me as his and his alone. "The girl asked for protection," he declared, his gaze never leaving mine, making his words a promise to me, not merely a warning to them. "She offered herself in return. I have accepted. She is mine. Her former claims are nullified by my presence and my claim. Go back to your village. If any of you ever attempt to claim her, or even utter her name in a disrespectful manner, consider your territory forfeit, your coven disbanded, and your lives ended." And just like that, I was no longer Chloe Sinclair, the Blackwood Omega. I was a possession, a claimed mate, of the Alpha King. I had traded servitude to a small-minded entitled Alpha for the binding claim of the most powerful male in existence. I had escaped one suffocating cage only to be ushered, breathless and still trembling, into the gilded, monumental fortress of Ethelred Citadel, the heart of the monarchy. The political war began immediately, the moment the Citadel gates closed behind us. Ethelred was a cold, sharp city, carved from massive blocks of white stone, its architecture soaring and intimidating, a dizzying contrast to the damp, dark wood of Blackwood. The air inside the citadel was thick with intrigue and the scent of highly polished, ruthless ambition. And I, the Omega who ran, was a foreign body, an immediate disruption, a scandal made flesh. The ruthless Senator Vivienne Hayes, a woman whose severe beauty was only surpassed by her icy, calculated efficiency and her absolute devotion to ancient political lineage, led the opposition. She saw me not as a person, but as an illegitimate threat to the carefully balanced power structure she had helped maintain for decades. The king's choice is merely a temporary claim until a more suitable consort, one with established political ties and lineage, can be arranged, she venomously informed me during a forced meeting over glacial tea in her private, austere salon. Her words were perfectly polite, delivered with a smile that promised sharp, drawn-out warfare, and my eventual humiliating exile. "You understand, Omega, that while the king's claim is absolute, its legitimacy within the court is fragile. He cannot afford a weakness at his side." Rhys, the intensely reclusive king, whose sheer presence commanded attention even when he was completely silent, demanded my engagement in court, not my easy submission. He treated me with an unnerving, yet compelling detachment, always observing, always assessing my reactions to the court's disdain. He never forced me, never touched me without invitation in public, demonstrating a respect that Wallace had never even considered. "The cage is only as confining as you allow it to be, Chloe," he told me one evening in the massive, echoing royal library. The room was lined with ancient volumes that seemed to absorb all sound, making his voice a deep, private comfort. "I need you to challenge me, not simply obey me. I do not want a docile Omega who submits to ancient tradition. I claimed a defiant one, who ran for her life and risked everything for her soul, and that is the one I require to stand as my queen." I was forced to learn a new kind of survival, navigating court politics, the poisonous whispers of the aristocracy, and the terrifying, heady development of our mate bond. The claim Rhys had made was deepening with every passing day, intensified by our close proximity and the undeniable pull of our species' biology. His scent, that heady mix of storm and ozone, became less a marker of terrifying danger and more a magnetic pull, a primal source of fierce, protective comfort that made my Omega instincts hum with a desperate, growing desire and need. I found myself anticipating his powerful touch, craving the heavy, solid certainty of his presence as an anchor in the chaotic citadel. The ultimate test arrived at the Feast of the Oath, the annual gathering where the entire monarchy reaffirmed its loyalty to the Alpha King. The immense banquet hall was blinding, a sea of glittering jewels, reflective silk, and predatory smiles under dazzling chandeliers. Rhys was giving his ceremonial speech, his voice powerful and absolute, when a sudden, sickeningly familiar presence cut through the rich, heavy scents of the feast and perfumes. Wallace Thompson, consumed by his small, desperate vengeance, and clearly aided by an external force, had returned. He had leveraged a massive bribe and old, deeply placed connections to gain entry, a pathetic viper seeking one final, fatal strike that would destroy me and destabilize Rhys. He waited for Rhys to pause his speech, then stood abruptly from a back table, his voice ringing with a devastating, public, and calculated lie designed to wound. "My king, there is a lie here in your court. The Omega you claimed is tainted. She betrayed her bond. She slept with me, her rightful alpha, hours before the ceremony. She is soiled. She is not fit to be your queen. She broke the coven's rules to be with me, then abandoned me for greater power. The magnificent hall froze instantly, the silence so profound that the clatter of a fallen fork sounded like a cannon shot. The weight of the accusation was crushing, potentially fatal. A soiled Omega, a deceitful prize. It was enough to shatter the legitimacy of Rhys's claim and force his hand into my immediate execution or exile. Rhys, however, did not move. He stood on the dais, utterly silent, his expression unreadable. He waited for me to answer my own accuser. I felt the blood rush from my face, then return with fiery, defiant speed, burning away the sudden, paralyzing fear. My mind, trained in the cold war of the Citadel, was suddenly crystal clear. This was the true moment of truth, the final battle for my reputation and my life. I pushed past the horrified guards who tried to restrain me. I stepped forward, walking directly toward the king's side, and facing Wallace and the vast, silent, judging crowd. "You are a desperate liar, Wallace," I stated, my voice ringing with a sudden, astonishing clarity and contempt that silenced the low, nervous murmuring of the court. On the summer solstice, I was fighting the mental fog of the binding sense, struggling to resist the terrible obedience your elders enforced upon my mind and soul. I ran from your entitlement, your pathetic claim, and your shallow cruelty, and I ran directly into the arms of the Alpha King. There was no betrayal of a bond, only escape from tyranny, and I sought refuge with the only male who could truly take me. He claimed me in that moment, in the forest, as a free woman trading her freedom for protection. That is the truth. And every person in this hall knows you are not man enough to inspire the kind of loyalty that breaks tradition, only the fear that makes women run. Rhys confirmed the claim with a single devastating sentence, his raw dominance wrapping around me like a shield of fire, a physical force that made the floor tremble. The Omega speaks the truth. She is mine. I claimed her freely, and she accepted freely. Wallace was escorted out, his face a mask of ruined fury, tossed back to the oblivion from which he came. But the battle was not over. Vivian Hayes made her final, lethal public challenge, stepping forward, her face a mask of disappointment. "With all due respect, my king, the Omega is a disruptive symbol of rebellion against the monarchy's most necessary traditions. She cannot be elevated. She stands against the very stability we cherish." I stepped forward again, my heart pounding a rhythm of pure, unadulterated resolve, ready for the final strike. "I am the Alpha King's queen consort precisely because I am a symbol of rebellion against stagnation. If a small, subservient Omega, deemed the lowest of all, could find the strength to defy tradition and risk death for freedom, that defiance is the very spirit needed to reform and strengthen this entire monarchy. I do not seek to destroy tradition, but to remind you of the strength of true, freely given loyalty over coerced submission." Rhys smiled then, a fierce, terrifyingly handsome expression that melted the ice in his eyes and promised fire and protection. He commanded Vivian's immediate resignation, stating her loyalty to outdated tradition outweighed her loyalty to the progressive stability of the crown. The political war was won, solidified not by Rhys's strength alone, but by my courageous, passionate defiance. In the quiet, luxurious refuge of our private chambers that night, the political battle finally gave way to the profound, shared intimacy of our destined connection. The room was soft, scented with burning cedar, and the intoxicating mix of our dual scents, a stark, comforting contrast to the crowded political air of the hall. Rhys held me close, his arms heavy and solid around my waist, his scent enveloping me completely, marking me as his in a way that had nothing to do with collars or laws. "I needed the court to witness your command, Chloe," he admitted, his deep voice rumbling against my ear, the sound a low vibration that thrilled my entire body. "They needed to see that the Omega who ran for freedom was the only person capable of standing beside the King of Freedom. You broke the mold. You are my greatest strength because you fight for what you believe is right, not just for survival." I looked up into his steel eyes, now softened by a quiet, deep warmth and an intense, focused adoration. I didn't fear the possessiveness in his gaze anymore. I coveted the absolute, protective certainty of it, the feeling of being utterly safe in the storm. "I regret nothing," I whispered, pressing closer to his powerful chest, inhaling the scent that was now my home. "I am an Omega who commands. I learned that freedom isn't the absence of constraints, but the power to choose who and what you are bound to, and why. I am bound to you, Rhys, by choice, by destiny, and by a fierce, undeniable love that your claim awakened in the deepest part of my soul." The mate bond, forged in a moment of desperation and tested by fire, had intensified into a fierce, genuine, life-altering love. I had asked a stranger for help to escape a cage built by a coward, and instead, he had given me the key to the entire kingdom, demanding only that I use it to its full, brilliant potential. I, Chloe, the defiant Omega, now walked the vast, echoing halls of the Ethelred Citadel with absolute purpose, not paralyzing fear. Our story was forever etched into the foundations of the monarchy, the powerful, unforgettable tale of the Alpha King who claimed the rebellious Omega, who dared to run toward the storm of her own magnificent destiny.